Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Talbot County, Maryland in 1818. In fall of 1838, Douglass escaped his master with the help of Anna Marie, who he would later marry once in New York, which is a free state. They would later continue to travel. With a growing audience eager to hear him speak, Douglass went from speaking in a small old post office to a church and to eventually a park. As numbers of his followers grew and attention increased, he decided to write and release his first autobiography in 1845 titled The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Eventually, his followers became aware that he was being hunted by a bounty hunter, and a few of his British followers purchased his freedom from his old master, Hugh Auld, in 1846. Garrison introduced Douglass to wealthy abolitionists in Boston and helped him gain allies and funding. Douglass's first story was about an evil slave master whom he spoke about on September 22, 1848. Douglass's installment in the North Star newspaper gained many subscribers, and Garrison had asked the North Star for more funding to help him print more copies. Douglass had also branched a paper from the Liberator called the Douglass Papers. Their relationship diminished after a meeting where supporters said Douglass's involvement was bigger than Garrison's because the color of his skin. Douglass was upset and published his feud in a paper, and the Liberator and the Douglass Papers were at a small battle. Douglass, once free, moved and purchased a house in Rochester, which would be a safe haven for fugitive slaves. Douglass also acquired the help of Martin R. Delaney and William Cooper Nell to start another anti-slavery paper titled the North Star, which they collaborated on and printed in the basement of the Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Douglass saw the North Star as a way to gain his independence from Garrison and other white abolitionists. Citizens of Rochester were upset that a black man was publishing papers from their town, but later praised him and his works to helping people of color gain supporters. He had also received praise from women's rights leaders and received praise and pointers from them. With many successes, he had also faced a few financial problems with his paper. He had to return to traveling and giving speeches about his plan and how to support the abolitionists of slavery. He eventually had to also mortgage his home and receive donations from friends. Main contributor to finance was Juliet Griffiths, who had also raised money to start the paper. With Griffiths' help, Douglass was also able to regain his Rochester home.
David Walker was born on September 28, 1796, and died on August 6, 1830. He was an outspoken African American and also an anti-slavery activist. His father was a slave and his mother was a free African American, certifying his freedom. As a young boy, he never attended school, therefore he was not educated. There was a black church from where he learned to read and write. In 1820, he was in Charleston, North Carolina, learning carpentry from Denmark Masia. Along with learning carpentry, he also learned about politics from him. In the 1820s, he set up a used clothing store in Boston, and by 1826, he became a writer for the first African-American newspaper, known as the Freedom's Journal. Walker had many issues and problems while growing up. He grew up to despise and have much hatred for the system of slavery that the American government allowed in the United States. He had been very concerned about social issues concerning and affecting the free and enslaved Africans in America. He expressed his many beliefs. Walker had written and published a pamphlet to the enslaved men and women of the South Advocate, a black rebellion, and a crushed slavery. He wanted to remind the African Americans that they are also Americans and that they should be treated fairly. This pamphlet was published on September 1829 and is known as the Appeal. The Appeal had horrified whites and slaveholders both in the South and North. In result, laws were initiated that forbid African Americans to learn how to read, and had banned the distribution of anti-slavery literature. Louisiana executed a bill ordering expulsion of all freed slaves who had settled in the state after 1825. With the controversy concerning Walker's pamphlet growing, a reward had been offered for his death. His friends urged him to move to Canada. He refused. When Walker was found dead in Boston on August 6, 1830. Many assumed that he was poisoned, and in fact he may also have died of tuberculosis, which had also killed his daughter. City records state that he was 33 when he died. Later on, Nat Turner led his bloody rebellion in 1831 as a result of Walker's appeal. William Lloyd Garrison, a white abolitionist, believed in having an immediate emancipation of slavery, but thought it could be accomplished through persuasion and argument. It did favor the spirit of the appeal, however, and ran large portions of it, together with his own review in his paper, The Liberator.
William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist leader in the 1800s. He was born December 10, 1805 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. He grew up with his mother, who was very religious. His family was poor since his father abandoned them early on. In 1818, Garrison became an apprentice for the newspaper called Newburyport Herald. After moving to Boston, he became editor of the National Philanthropist, which was a newspaper that supported temperance. While working there, a man named Benjamin Lundy offered him a job to be an editor at the Genius of Emancipation. This was the opportunity that got Garrison into the abolitionist movement. At first, he supported the American Colonization Society, thinking that it supported equality of blacks and whites, but he soon realized that the people he was working with supported the idea of shipping free blacks back to Africa to make America a one-race country. After being put in jail for some of the things he wrote as editor at Genius of Emancipation, Garrison started his own newspaper called The Liberator in 1830, and in 1832 founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. A quote from the first issue of his newspaper stated, "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." This quote is basically a warning to the reader saying that he will stand up for what he believes in. He also talks about giving freed slaves the right to vote and citizenship. Issues of the newspaper mainly talks about equality for African Americans. His newspaper influenced many blacks as it circulated throughout the South. Garrison had many black supporters behind his movement, but not as many whites. Garrison also stood up for women's rights. The World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840 was held in London. However, women weren't allowed to attend, so Garrison didn't go either. Garrison and Douglass met in 1841 at an anti-slavery society meeting. During this meeting, Douglass was asked to tell his story about what it was like being a slave and how he escaped. They became friends and worked together in the abolitionist movement. In 1845, Garrison's paper, The Liberator, published Douglass's story, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. In 1848, Douglass started his own newspaper called The North Star, and that was when the two started to split. Douglass realized that he needed to stand up for the abolition movement on his own since it was more powerful instead of working with a white man. They had also started to have different ideas. The Civil War ended in 1865. Garrison lived to see when the 13th Amendment was made to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the United States in both the North and the South. He died on May 24, 1879, but in his lifetime he accomplished so much and was very successful in the abolitionist movement.
Harriet Beecher Stowe was born on June 14, 1811 in Litchfield, Connecticut, to her father, Lyman Beecher, who was a leading Congregationalist minister and a patriarch of a family dedicated to achieving social justice. Harriet Beecher was perhaps the most well-known of the 9 Beecher children. However, they were all raised in an environment that prompted them all to become involved in making a difference in the world by taking action. Harriet learned to read from her aunt, Harriet Foote, and at 6, her father remarried Harriet Porter. Harriet Beecher attended Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Academy. Then, in 1824, at age 13, she moved to Hartford, Connecticut, to attend a school founded and run by her eldest sister, Catherine Beecher. Hartford Female Seminary provided her with a higher-level education that most women at the time did not have the opportunity to attain. In 1826, the Beechers moved from Litchfield to Boston, Massachusetts, where Lyman was a minister at the Hanover Church. As a Calvinist preacher in Boston, he wasn't as successful as he'd hoped to be, so the Beechers moved again in 1834 to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he attained a pastor position at a church while in Cincinnati, and many of the Beechers, including Harriet, joined the Semicolon Club. Here, Harriet was introduced to reading and critiquing others' writing, and they critiqued and read hers, and the club often debated social issues such as slavery. In 1836, she married Calvin Ellis Stowe, a professor at her father's theological seminary. During their time in Cincinnati, the Stows met and talked with many slaves that had escaped to Ohio from neighboring Kentucky and Virginia. They were friends with abolitionists and participated in the Underground Railroad. Harriet Beecher Stowe used many of the encounters and experiences of her time spent in Ohio and Kentucky with the slaves in what gave her national fame and platform, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. Eventually, in 1873, the Stows moved to Hartford, Connecticut, where they were neighbors with Mark Twain and lived there until she died at 85 years old on July 1st, 1896. Unlike other abolitionist leaders, Stowe was born into a family all dedicated to social justice and ultimately abolition. However, her platform in this movement was earned with the help of her deep religious belief that it was cruel and ungodly to treat any human the way slaves were treated, because she was educated, raised in a Calvinist family committed to changing society, and because she saw firsthand the cruelty of slavery. In her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, many scenes and characters were based on people and experiences that Harriet had throughout her life. For example, the character Uncle Tom himself embodied noble and heroic characteristics of slaves she met through her life that showed her strength and courage and faith in situations that were dire. This character was mainly based on the life of a man named Josiah Henson, a slave who had opportunities to escape or have his freedom bought, but as he recalled, he'd rather purchase his own freedom for himself. Stowe's powerful novel started out as installments in the National Era, and in 1851 served to paint a picture depicting the human cruelty of slavery. There ended up being over 40 installments in the National Era magazine, and Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin a year later as a novel. This novel was said to have intensified sectionalism before the American Civil War. During the Civil War, the Stows supposedly met Abraham Lincoln, and it's said that he greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Stowe continued to write and to teach about social and political issues for the rest of her life, publishing essays, textbooks, novels, and articles, and a letter in 1853 wrote, "I wrote what I did because as a woman, as a mother, I was oppressed and broken-hearted with the sorrows and injustice I saw. Because as a Christian, I felt the dishonor to Christianity. Because as a lover of my county, I trembled at the coming day of wrath." In her life, Harriet Beecher Stowe established herself as a major author, an abolitionist, social advocate, and a philanthropist. While her fame somewhat faded after her death, the legacy lived on in her novel. In the 70s, the feminist movement reclaimed Harriet as a key feminist figure and a figure of scholarly interest, and author Joan Hedrick won a Pulitzer Prize for her 1994 biography of Stowe. Even in 2006, Henry Louis Gates, an eminent African-American scholar, published an annotated Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe's bravery and voice in the abolitionist movement heavily influenced the outcome of the slavery issue in this country.